Well, I'm going to say I've already shown you the log house in which I believe that I was conceived, not born, but conceived. And that was in early, sometime in 1917. No, to be 1960. There, I'm all messed up already. Start again. I was born in Swan River, actually, in the hospital in Swan River. My father paid for my birth by cutting cordwood, lots of trees around in those days, and he cut cordwood, and he paid his bill at the hospital by taking in loads of cordwood to the hospital. Then this picture that you're looking at, I was about 18 months old when that was taken, and my mother had taken me down to Oak Lake to say goodbye to her brother Pete, who had joined the army and was expected to go overseas. And as you can see, I'm holding his staff. In this picture, I suppose we can hold it up that way, because I was wearing button shoes and what looks like more or less like spats up above that, but that's the way they were sort of wrinkled things, but that's the sort of things we had to wear on our feet at that age. And when I was still wearing button shoes while I was going to school, because I can remember morning after morning sitting on the floor crying because I couldn't find a button hook and I couldn't get my shoes buttoned. They weren't the nicest kind of shoes to wear. This is my mother and father. They were married in 1916 in Brandon, and then they went down to Oak Lake and Woodnorth for their honeymoon with the Jordan family. Dad was 28, I believe, and mother was 22 then. And she felt like a spinster because in her family everyone had got married at 21 or younger, so she thought she was a little too old. This is my Grandma Tall. That's Alf's mother, and she was born in England, and she got married in England and had one son in England. And then after the baby was born, their first son, her husband Harry would be about 20 then, I think. He came out to Canada. He was the first Tall to ever come to Canada, and he came out then and got a job in Montreal and tried to save up enough money to bring Grandma home out to Canada. And my grandmother, you can see where I got my stubbornness and why most of the family have a streak of stubbornness. Harry wanted to be able to say that he had saved enough money to take care of his wife and bring her out. But Grandma, my grandmother, was pretty strong-willed, and she was determined she'd get a job so she'd get out that much sooner. So it took about 6 weeks for a letter to get to and fro, and she got a job, and it took a long time, 6 weeks coming to get back, and by that time Harry had stopped trying to make her stay out of the workforce. But he was young and wanted to be able to say he could take care of his family. The family were shipbuilders at Topsham, Devon, but the shipbuilding industry had gone to pot, and they had to turn to other work. Another relative, who was my great-grandfather, I believe it was what they called a thatcher, which meant putting thatched roofs on houses. And then the thatching went out, and that's when he went to shipbuilding. And the family were in shipbuilding until they changed the style of ships, and there was no work for them. When Mother was about 8 or 9, when my grandma was about 8 or 9, her family lived in a seaport town which had a shipyard in which her father worked. As the shipbuilding yard was open to the weather, the men seldom got in a full week's work. This would be in the late 1850s, before the days of trade unions. and the wages were so low that Grandma was hard-pressed many times to provide food for the family. As the three older boys grew old enough, they were apprenticed to a trade. The workmen were paid every 2 weeks, so funds frequently ran out before next payday. That was when Grandfather's Wellingtons began their travels. These boots, of good leather, polished to a high gloss, together with a black broadcloth suit and tall hat, were Grandfather's Sunday best, and were only worn to chapel. So it was quite safe for Grandma to raise a little money on them. The pawnbroker's shop, with its three golden bells, was only a few blocks away. So my grandmother was given the job of taking the boots down there whenever Grandma ran short of cash. It wasn't too bad taking them and returning with the 10 shillings she got. But when on payday she was sent to redeem them, she would find a long line of people on the same errand and would stand in line for a weary time awaiting her turn. Grandma accused her of loitering and of playing with other children, so one day she went herself, and never again did she blame Mother for taking so long. All this was kept a close secret between the two of them, for it would have been a great blow to Grandpa's pride to know his boots went out without him. This went on for many months until the boots began to show signs of wear, so finally Grandma raised as much as she could and left them there. I thought it was kind of a cute story. They did consider going to Australia. That was the Wescotts, my great grandparents were going to go to Australia, and that was the one tragedy. They had 7 children, and that was the one tragedy in the family, because great grandpa, was going to go to the Australian embassy or whatever office it was, and the boy wanted to go to make sure his grandpa went there because he wanted to go to Australia, his father rather. And he was running to tell his father what he thought, and he wasn't very old. He was only about 7 or 8. And he fell and hit his head on the pavement and died. So that sort of changed all their plans. And it also, in a way, changed the date of my grandparents coming to Canada, because they went into mourning. In those days you had to go into black for a year, and they had to make clothes for mourning for the boy, and Grandma and Grandpa had already planned their wedding, and so she compromised. She did get married, but she wore mauve because she didn't want to get married in black, but then she had to go back to the black, and they got married a few months later. But that finished their plans to go to Australia. So Grandpa came out, Grandpa Tall, Harry Tall, and as I said, he was the first Tall to come to Canada, and he got this job, and then they got enough money together that Grandma was able to come out when their first son was maybe 18 months. Took about 2 years before he got enough money. And when she got to Canada, they had a daughter, and she died of diphtheria. I've heard a couple of stories. Of the one Grandma used to tell was of how she tried to get this baby to a doctor, and she was pulling her on a little hand sled in Montreal, and the baby died while she was on the way to get a doctor. So that was one of the biggest tragedies of her life. That and her oldest son's death when he was 21. But they stayed. Grandpa Tall I was in a sort of a paving business, he and another man, but it was too hard on his lungs. The consequent dust affected. They ran a road roller. Grandpa and his partner, Mr. Davis, and the consequent dust affected Father's health. So the doctor advised him to move to the country. At this time, Winnipeg, Manitoba was beginning to boom, but Mother had heard of blizzards and Indians and wolves, so was afraid to take her little brood there. The only alternative was to go to Muskoka, where land was being offered to settlers. Some friends had gone there and wrote about the beauties of the place, with springs and streams and lakes of soft water, and all the variety of trees and wild fruit, but not of the shallow layer of soil that covered the rock under the trees. So they packed up to move to Kearney. Some of their hard times there, they were so poor, it's almost indescribable. My grandmother, incidentally, before she got married, was in service, as they called it. She was, the lady she worked for was Lady Harriet, and she called one of her daughters Harriet afterwards. When Mother grew old enough, she went into service as a housemaid general. For a time she lived in London, and told of going to the Crystal Palace and the noted show people that she saw there. There was the two-headed nightingale, a pair of Siamese twins joined at the neck, but still two separate entities, Chang the Chinese giant, who was 9 feet tall, and Tom Thumb the midget. The place of service my grandmother, remembered and talked of most was when she worked for Mrs. Chambers and her daughter Bella. Mrs. Chambers was a Spanish woman who had married a colonel who was a surgeon in the army. There was also a son in the family who was an army captain. Mrs. Chambers felt herself above her neighbors and the common people, so treated Mother as a menial. Mother worked there for 2 years, so as it was essential to have a good character or testimonial to get a new place. However, Grandma heard of another place that she could get without a reference, so she gave notice to quit. Mrs. Chambers was so annoyed that she dismissed her a day before her time was up, so Mother was able to go to a ship launching, a gala affair. Sometime previous to this, Mary had been going to a Sunday school picnic, but was not sure of the way, so stopped to ask directions from a little boy. A voice out of a tree said, "Straight ahead, miss." A little later, the young man appeared at the picnic ground, and as he knew her brother, asked for an introduction. That young man was Harry Tall, and later became Mary's husband. Harry was a very shy and modest young man, so when one rainy day he kissed her under her umbrella and said, "I think we understand each other," Mary shyly assented, and they were engaged.